This AFE Magnum Force Stage 2 XP cold air intake with the Pro 5R oiled filter in black is for anyone with a 2018 and up JL that has that 3.6 liter engine in it that's looking for a cold air intake to provide them with a little bit better throttle response, a few additional MPGs, and some more noise from underneath the hood when you really stab the throttle. This is going to be a nice easy 1 out of 3 wrenches for the installation, and we're going to show you how to do it in just a second. If you are looking for a cold air intake, chances are you're looking for one of those 3 things. Again, improved MPG, improved throttle response, and more sound from underneath the hood, as well as a little bit of horsepower and torque. The horsepower and torque numbers are really going to show up at the top of the RPM range, where we don't spend a ton of time in our Jeeps, but they are going to be there. And when you're looking for a cold air intake, you're going to find a couple of different types. The main ones being ones that have a heat shield like this one, or ones that have a fully enclosed airbox similar to the factory system, but still opening things up and trying to get more colder air into the engine. Now, the ones with the sealed airbox are generally going to be a little bit more expensive because there's just more material there. But if you're looking for one that's a little bit less expensive, or you just want all of the benefits of a open air filter like this with no airbox at all, going with one that just has a heat shield like this is going to be a really nice choice. In that realm, there's still going to be a couple of big decisions to make, and one of those is going to be what this tube is going to be made out of. This one is going to be aluminum, which has a black powder coated finish on it, which is going to be a little bit more expensive. Aluminum in general is a more expensive material than, say, plastic or even a stainless or another type of steel might be, and the fact that it's then powder coated, that adds to the cost a little bit as well. And these certainly aren't bad things. It's just something that I do want to point out. If you're looking for a more budget friendly cold air intake, one with a plastic air intake tube is going to be less expensive. This one a little bit fancier, a little bit more expensive, has a really nice look to it. This is also going to come with that Pro 5R oiled air filter. This is a nice big air filter, the idea being that it's going to get the most air into the engine, be the least restrictive, and because it is an oiled filter, it's something you can pull out of the Jeep, wash it off, re-oil it if need be, and pop it back in again, so you're going to be able to reuse it over and over again. And a lot of the cold air intake systems on the market are coming with a filter like that these days, so that's not unique to AFE, but it is a really nice feature to have. Other than that, this is going to install very easily into your Jeep. It's going to look pretty good, and overall it's going to function pretty well also. Now, one thing to note about really any cold air intake, whether it be one of those closed box ones or more something like this, which has an open air filter, is if you do a lot of water crossings or do a lot of wheeling in wet areas, there's always a chance that you could get a little bit of a wave coming over the hood or up from underneath. You could get some water sucked in here, and if water ends up in the engine, that is a very bad thing. Where the factory airbox or some of the aftermarket cold air intakes with a sealed airbox are going to buy you a little bit of time. That airbox generally needs to fill up with water first before that water gets into the engine. So again, if you do a lot of wheeling in the water or in those wet areas, an open element cold air intake like this maybe not the best idea for you. Now, we pointed out a couple of things about this cold air intake system that do make it one of the nicer ones on the market, and is also going to make it a little bit more expensive. The main ones being the material that the intake tube is made out of, and the fact that this is one of those washable and reusable filters. This system comes in at right around $330, which again, not the most expensive one. The ones that have those closed air boxes generally are going to be a little bit more expensive, but if you're looking for one a little bit more budget friendly, if you find one with a plastic intake tube, they're generally going to be even less expensive than this is. So like we mentioned, very, very simple to get this installed on the Jeep, 1 out of 3 wrenches. Let me show you how to do it. For this installation, we used an 8mm and a 10mm socket, along with a 5/32 inch Allen head socket and a 3/8 extension, driven by both our 3/8 socket driver and our 3/8 electric impact, and we also used our trim removal tool. So we're gonna get started on this very easy 1 out of 3 wrench installation. As you can tell, we have the hood popped, and we're gonna start by removing these couple of bolts that hold the air intake tube to the radiator support. Once those are removed, there's a clamp at the throttle body and a couple of hoses we need to remove. Then we can pull the whole intake assembly out of the Jeep. And we're going to unplug the air intake temperature sensor. We'll just push the tab and unplug it for now, but we are going to remove that from the intake and put it into our new intake in just a second. While we're in this area, we're also going to disconnect a couple of clamps that we have holding some wiring in place. So these are just going to be those Christmas tree style clips. We'll use our trim removal tool and pry them up out of the way. Now we can move on to disconnecting the breather. So to disconnect our vent tube from the fitting here, you just push down on the gray piece of plastic and give it a pull. Lastly, there's one more bolt here on the fender holding our intake assembly in the Jeep. So we'll remove that. Now we can pull the whole factory intake out of the Jeep. As you can see, when you have your factory intake next to your new cold air intake, there are some pretty drastic differences. The first one we'll talk about is going to be the material. Obviously, this is all plastic. This one is going to be metal. It's going to look a little bit better. It's going to hold up pretty well under the engine bay. Other than that, not a huge functional difference between metal and plastic. One of the big functional differences that you are going to find, though, is that this is a closed air box, where this system here has a shield and this big open element filter. So this is going to allow a lot more air into the engine. It's going to be a lot less restrictive than this factory airbox is. All of the air into the factory airbox comes in through one of two fairly small inlets. This, of course, much less restrictive, much more air can get in there. But being that it is a cold air intake, there is still going to be a little bit of a heat shield here. And the idea there is that it's pulling air from the coldest part of the engine bay, where here this is going to be pulling air from, again, this small little bit of an intake here that's in the front right-hand corner of the Jeep, but much less air can get into this system. This is going to be a very complicated system. As you can see, there are a lot of bits and pieces hanging off of this, where your new intake tube is very clean, very simple. Again, a lot less restriction. The idea here is to get the most and coldest air into the engine, and this is going to be a very simple way of doing that when you compare it to your factory intake. So with your factory intake on the table, there are a couple of pieces that we're going to scavenge off of this to use for our new installation of our new cold air intake. And those are going to be our intake air temperature sensor, which is located right here. We're going to be able to give that a little bit of a turn and pull and pop that in our new intake tube. And also these two rubber grommets that are used for mounting the intake tube onto the rad support, we're going to take those as well. As with most sensors, you do want to be careful with this while removing it, but you can give it a little bit of a pull and a twist and wiggle it out of there. As you can see, it is pretty fragile, so you want to be careful not to damage that. And we're going to set that aside to install in our new air intake tube in just a second. We're also going to be removing those rubber grommets that I spoke about. You can just grab those and give them a pull, and they'll come right out of that factory tube. One and the other one. Now we can set our factory intake off to the side. Now we'll grab our new cold air intake tube from AFE, and we're going to do a little bit of disassembly of these rubber grommets just to make them a little bit easier to press into these two holes. So there is a metal sleeve on the rubber grommet, and they can be a little bit stubborn, but if you separate the rubber from the metal, then you can press the rubber piece into this hole and then slide the metal sleeve in. Again, it just makes it a little bit easier to do. So once you have the rubber fully seated, you can press that metal center section, that metal crush sleeve, back up through the middle. And we'll do the same for the other one. Now we'll put our intake air temp sensor into our new intake tube. This has a small rubber O-ring around it, so if you wanted to, you could put a little bit of lubrication on there. You want to make sure that the O-ring isn't going to roll or tear during the installation. And this really only sits one way in the air intake tube. You're going to put it in and give it that roughly eighth of a turn, maybe quarter turn, just like you did to get it out of the factory intake tube, and it'll clip into your new cold air intake. Now we can move on to preparing our heat shield, and the only thing we really have to do to this is install this bit of weather stripping on the top, and that's so that this is going to make a nice tight seal with the hood, not chafe or damage any of the painted surfaces on the Jeep. So you have your weather stripping here. It does actually have a little bit of metal on the inside of it that'll help it latch on across the top of your heat shield. So we're just gonna press this in place. Next, we're going to install this plastic coupler into our heat shield. This is going to get our air filter on one end and our intake tube with a rubber grommet on the other end. And this has a couple of threaded holes in the back side of it, so we get it aligned with the 3 holes here in the heat shield. And then we have 3 screws to attach it with. Once we have the 3 screws started by hand, we'll tighten them up. Next, we'll put this small reducer on the other end of the coupler that we just installed. So we're going to slide one of our clamps over the end of that first. We can loosen that up if need be. It looks like it's just fine like that. And it'll slide over top of our plastic piece here. Then we can tighten it down. There we go. The next step is going to be installing our air intake tube itself onto that reducer that we just installed. And we are going to fit everything together here. We're going to use our hose clamps, but we are going to leave them a little bit loose because you're going to want to be able to rotate this to get these mounting points lined up once we get over to the Jeep. I'll just put a little bit of tension on that clamp, and we can always tighten it up the rest of the way in the vehicle. Now we can move on to the other end of our intake tube here. And we have this coupler that's going to attach the intake tube onto the throttle body. And just like everywhere else, we have a hose clamp to install that with. This last smaller hose clamp is to attach that coupler onto the throttle body. Again, we're going to leave that loose until we get it installed in the Jeep. And once this whole assembly is installed in the Jeep, then we'll go back and install our air filter on the end. Now we just have a couple more screws we need to remove from the Jeep that are going to be used as our mounting locations for our heat shield before we can get our new intake installed. So we're going to have 2 bolts right up here on the battery box, 1 down low and 1 on our radiator. We'll remove all of those with a 10mm socket. Now we'll install our cold air intake system into the Jeep. So we're going to start by positioning this end over the throttle body. Then we'll put our screws in these two mounting points on the top of the radiator and finish up by installing the mounting points through the heat shield that we just removed the bolts from. Now we can line the mounting points on our intake tube with the ones on our radiator from our factory intake and reinstall the factory hardware. Now we can reinstall all of these factory screws back into the locations we removed them from, but now with the heat shield in place as well. We'll make it a little bit easier if you start all the hardware by hand and then go back and tighten it up after everything is started. All of that hardware started, we'll go back and tighten it up. Now we can get our air filter installed in our new heat shield on our air intake tube, and of course it has its own large hose clamp that it'll attach with. Now we can work our way back from the filter toward the throttle body, tightening all of our clamps and plugging everything back in. And that's really going to finish up the installation. The last thing we're going to do is install this one bolt in the fender here. This bolt had to come out to get the factory air intake out, and we don't reuse the mounting location, so it's really just putting the bolt back in there to dress things up a little bit. And that's going to finish up the installation. So if you are looking for a fairly simple cold air intake for your JL, I would recommend taking a look at this option from AFE, and you can find it right here at extremeterrain.com.